like to start this unit looking at ideology, because we're looking about what governments are, their purposes, and what they do, and your belief system about what the proper role of government is will come into play when you're trying to make judgments about the actions that government takes and whether they're appropriate or inappropriate. So ideology is that statement of that set of beliefs that everyone holds about the proper role of government. So we're going to start with this topic as one of our first topics because I think it will give meaning to everything that follows if you cover this right from the very beginning. Now here you have the basic ideology spectrum. Many books, and I pulled this from a textbook, have this straight line spectrum. Liberals are to the left, conservatives are to the right, moderates in the center. You have the fringe ends, the radicals and the reactionaries. And basically the idea is that it's a continuous spectrum that everything falls upon and everybody neatly falls on this spectrum. Many times when you take an ideology quiz, which you have an opportunity to do in one of the level 1 assignments, it puts a lot of people in the middle when they say, well, I'm not so sure that I'm really moderate. But the problem is that this straight line spectrum is not sufficient. There's really two spectrums. There's an economic spectrum and there's a social spectrum. And so the ideas that liberals have about how much the government should regulate and be involved in things in one spectrum are opposite from what they are in the other spectrum, and same with conservatives. And so a lot of times those tests are not as accurate because they lump all the kinds of questions together, and so you end up with a score that throws you in the middle when that's not really where you belong. The best tests will give you a little bit more nuanced look at it and stick you into a grid. So let's talk about these different spectrums. As I said, one is the social spectrum. How much regulation should the government do of your personal behaviors? Now, liberals are not going to want the government to regulate individual behavior very much. So social and political liberals favor limited government regulation of individual behaviors. On the opposite of that, though, conservatives tend to favor broader government regulation of individual behaviors. So just to pick a couple of examples from this chart, and study all of these. Make sure you understand all the examples. I'm just going to pick out a couple to talk about. But for instance, on the issue of abortion, liberal position would be that it's not the government's place to tell a woman what she can do with her body, that is an individual privacy issue and an individual decision that government should not regulate. The conservative position would be that when a woman is expecting a baby, that there's two individuals there and the rights of the baby also come into play, and so therefore it's appropriate for the government, mostly for the good of the community and the unborn child, to regulate that behavior on the mother's part. It's sort of a nuanced difference. Hopefully you see it. Another good example would deal with censorship of film, music, etc., or just regulation of it. For instance, the warning labels on music, explicit or clean, and those came about because of policy that felt that parents should understand what they're buying for their minor children. Liberals in general would be against that kind of regulation. They'd say, people should buy whatever they want. You want girly magazines or pornography out there, well, parents should protect their children from it. It's not the job of the government or the state, and individuals should be free to express themselves the way they want to and to purchase what they want, etc. The conservative perspective would be, no, that regulation is good. It's good to put rating systems out there so people know what to expect, to cover up the cover of magazines like that, to put PG, R, NC-17 kind of ratings on films, the sorts of ratings, is it not for children under 13, whatever the TV ratings are, I don't watch much TV, that it's okay to do that. So you're looking at how much the government regulates. On the social, liberals think very little government regulation, conservatives think more. Now the other spectrum is the economic spectrum. Economic liberals want broader government regulation of economic matters, while economic conservatives want less government regulation. See how these are the opposite? If you have to go back a little bit and look at it, they have the opposite position on the two spectrums. That's why the straight line's not going to work. So liberals are going to favor more progressive taxes, where your tax rates increase based on your income level, with the poorest not paying any taxes and the richest paying a higher percentage. Conservatives would favor more regressive tax structures like the flat tax or sales taxes, where everybody pays the same percentage or amount no matter what, because those are dealing with how much the government regulates. Also, assistance programs for the poor or the elderly, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, those kinds of programs. Liberals will favor those programs. We should help the least of these, kind of an idea. Whereas conservatives will say, well, that's not the government's place to provide it. Private individuals should save for themselves. Charities and churches and religious communities should help the poor. It shouldn't be the government or the state doing it. Okay, so they have these different perspectives that look polar opposite, probably aren't as polar opposite as they seem, because all of us are operating from this liberal, democratic, Republican idea, but we have different perspectives on the role of government. So here you have a grid structure, and you can see when you have from the bottom left corner, you have the most freedom from government regulation, up to more regulation on the economic scale, to the vertical scale, and the social and political is the horizontal scale. And you see your liberals and your conservatives, how they fit in based on what we've discussed. You also have to fit in two more ideologies, libertarians and totalitarians. Libertarians believe in as little regulation of either type of issue by the government. Libertarians really believe less government is better, and they want as little government as possible in every perspective. There's a strong libertarian presence in Alabama, so it's probably one you're familiar with. The totalitarian position is not totalitarian like we think of Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, that kind of totalitarian dictatorship, but rather it's more the idea that we need more government control because, our morals are going to hell in a handbasket, and our economy needs lots of regulation to prevent bad things from happening and from helping the unfortunate, and so the government should regulate all of those things more. That's the opposite perspective of it. The reality is most of us fall somewhere close to the center of where all of those intersect, rather than in the extremes. There are a couple of other things you have to look at. One is how each side views interpretation of the Constitution. The liberal perspective will favor what's called loose construction or loose constructionism. That means that the Constitution should be interpreted very broadly. What does it say today? Have our community standards evolved to a point, for instance, that we now believe that enslaving people is wrong, so therefore our interpretation should reflect that. Conservatives, on the other hand, favor what's called a strict construction or strict constructionism, which is a much more narrow interpretation. Basically, they believe the interpretation should remain constant over time, and it's more an idea of what would the founders have done, what did they mean, rather than what do we think now. When it comes to change versus tradition, I'm sure it's no surprise to know that liberals are going to favor change more than conservatives do. Conservatives, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They're going to want those traditional values and traditional ways of doing things. In the issue of individual versus community, liberals will favor the perspective of the individual and the rights of the individual. Conservatives will tend to put the value of the rights of the community as a whole higher than they do those for the individual. A good example of that would be the sex offender notification laws. Those are the laws that say that if someone has been convicted of a sex crime, maybe you're a child molester or rapist, that will follow you the rest of your life. When you leave prison, you have to register with the local police department and tell them your address, and you have to check in every year, and people are notified about it. The liberal perspective on that would be, hey, these people have served their time, this is a violation of their personal liberty, and leave them alone. The conservative perspective is, hey, these people often reoffend, and the community needs to know what they've done, and so we should notify because the community's values and the community's safety is more important than the individuals. And that takes us to one of the basic questions in a democratic society especially is, how do you have government balance liberty versus order? Okay, liberals will tend to side with liberty, conservatives more with order. And of course, all of us have our own personal threshold of where we side in that debate and that question. And then finally, here you see it all put together. The reality is, as I mentioned briefly before, most people will fit somewhere within the parameters of that big yellow circle there. Your presidential candidates are going to fall somewhere in there because, if they're out at the extremes, the polar opposites, the rest of us won't vote for them. And most of us fit somewhere within the center part of that. Most of us are not so ideological that we're out at the extremes. We're closer to the center. There's a good activity in the level 1 activities where it asks you to take some ideology quizzes, to take 2 and compare your results, and I would encourage you to do that. It can be interesting to verify what you believe about the role of government before you start studying things where you have to make judgments about the role of government. If you have questions, let me know.